So good evening all together here in Edith Marian's house and internationally, hopefully. Yes, we decided from the General Anthroposophical section this year not to forget this 100th death day and year of Franz Kafka, this most famous writer of the 20th century. And we wanted to integrate these lectures commemorating him in this serial of lectures about Hebrew humanism, as Martin Buber called it. And some of you know that since some years we tried to follow this light path of Jewish thinkers of the 20th century who really opened windows for future development. Now we are living in very sad times concerning Palestine, Gaza, and the whole Jewish question seems to be again such a difficult one. But these serial of lectures are not part of the actual political situation, even if those Jewish thinkers, especially Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt, they always were engaged, took part in the struggle for a better future in Palestine. So they were not out of the time, but part of the time. And also in the case of Franz Kafka, we will touch Palestine at a certain point, which is not so well known as most of his works. But I will start with an anthroposophical starting point. I once came across that Kafka, the day before he died, sent a letter to his parents. He couldn't write anymore. He couldn't talk anymore. He has a final stage of tuberculosis and also of the larynx. But he could express something in a letter to his parents. And part of this last message was his great joy that there is a young doctor coming 3 times a week on his bedside from Vienna. At this time, Kafka was in a sanatorium close to Vienna in a little village called Kierling, where he died. But in the last letter, the day before he went, he is expressing his joy about this young doctor. And also a friend of Kafka, another doctor, Jewish doctor, but more a friend than his doctor, Robert Klopstock, who accompanied Kafka in these last weeks, sent another letter to the parents of Kafka saying, the new doctor, whom Franz trusts so much, who takes care of everything so naturally, is incredibly important and reassuring. And I was really deeply touched when I came across the fact that this doctor was the anthroposophical doctor Norbert Glass, also of Jewish origin. He came 3 times a week from Vienna to see after Kafka, called by the last and best, forever best friend of Franz Kafka, Dora Dumont, a young 6 years old woman. Yeah, they were in love, and she accompanied Franz Kafka till the end and beyond, together with Robert Klopstock. And she obviously asked Dr. Glass. And later on in his memory, he said, Miss Diamant must have known about my relationship to Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy. And this was the reason why I had been called. We don't know much, and there is a very good biography about Dora Dumont by Kathy Diamant, but she doesn't mention this last young doctor. But we know it quite well also because after the first visit to Kafka, who was at this time already a famous writer, Dr. Glass sent an asking letter to Ite Wegman, asking for advice how to treat this patient. And he describes the very miserable situation of Kafka, also describes in this letter what he gave him as the first drugs and kind of treatment. and then asking her and Steiner for advice, and asked, please send directly the drugs from Arlesheim to Kirling. And then also describing at the end of the letter, saying, Mr. Kafka is a very delicate being mentally, who must be treated extremely delicately and finely. So very soft treatment, fine treatment is necessary. And also Kafka, Glass, in the same letter to Ite Wegmann for advice, he states that he spoke to some of the colleagues who treated Kafka before and that they regarded him as dying. And then Dr. Glass is saying to Ite Wegmann, I really want to do everything I can to bring this person back to life. This letter is not dated, but it must have been in May 1924. He died 3rd of June. And he came, Kafka, to the sanatorium on Holy Saturday, Easter time in 24. Here in Dornach, there were these Easter lectures of Steiner. Some of you will know. And on Easter Monday, Steiner gave a course for young doctors. And one of them was Norbert Glass. That means he came from Dornach and Arlesheim more or less back to Vienna and was called to Kafka. And also an interesting element from an anthroposophical point of view is that on Thursday after Easter, in these lectures for the doctors, for the young doctors, Steiner suddenly was talking about tuberculosis. And then not only about tuberculosis in generally, how to treat it, which he did quite often. And it is it was a common disease after the First World War. But now he was talking about a very specific situation. He was describing that there are certain individualities. They bring their power of individuality from the past, but they fail in living it out in their life biography because this moral impulse is coming confronted with the materialistic outer world. And some of these very sensitive people, in a way, Steiner said, they were pushed back into their own body. So the individuality, instead of going into the world, is grasping the organs of the body, especially the lung. And this description may be Norbert Glass, who was a good listener, had in mind a person frightened by the world. This was a description by one of the best friends of Kafka, Milena Jesenska, a Czech journalist. He was frightened by the world. Pushed back, maybe. So good to hear that Norbert Glass was there right at the end. And as Robert Klopstock said, takes care of everything. We know that if patients are really dying or severely ill, there is such a need for taking care. Dora took care for him, a nurse in the sanatorium, Robert, the friend. But then Norbert Glass came. I don't know much about it, but it was an enormous discovery. And also this letter to Ite Wegmann. Then he died. And therefore we have this lecture. Once he said in a notebook entry, I would entrust myself to death. Remnant of a faith. Return to the Father. Great day of atonement. There is another very special description of Franz Kafka, of the process of dying. Before entering the Holy of Holies, you must take off your shoes, but not only your shoes, but everything. Traveling clothes and luggage, and underneath that nakedness and everything that is hidden underneath that nakedness. And then the core, and then the core of the core, and then the rest, and then the rest of the rest, and then still the glow of imperishable fire. Only the fire itself is absorbed by the Holy of the Holies and allows itself to be absorbed by it. Neither of them could resist it. A process of purification not only clothes, but also what is underneath the clothes, the nakedness, and then what is underneath the nakedness, the core, and then the core of the core, and then the rest, and then the rest of the rest, and then also this shining fire, but then you will come to the real fire, and this fire will communicate or undergo a union with this holy fire. This is a little introduction to the situation of dying. So I want to describe in several steps the spiritual gesture of Kafka. It won't be at all an interpretation of his famous works. I will try to approach the person behind the work, but not psychologically. And I will choose a path beginning with a short description of elements which are well known. I think most of you listening tonight are Kafka readers. And also came across Kafka as a person, maybe the letters or the diaries or the biographies. I will just recapitulate some maybe typical traits of his inner struggling with himself. And then also I will touch the point of his understanding of writing. He was really an author, a writer. A writer being completely alone, saying you need this being completely alone to write. So he is sometimes regarded as being isolated. But then I will come on a third step to the mystery of encounter. Because all those who know Kafka's biography know that he was a real good friend. He was not as isolated as we could think. And this leads me to the fourth point, Dora Dumont, and this last loving relationship, which is closely related to East European Judaism and also the desire to Palestine. And the ending point will be a little description of the charisma of his spiritual being. I try to do it all in the next 40 minutes. Hope I will succeed. Then we will have here a shorter break. And after me, Constanza Kaliks will give a lecture about another extremely brilliant Jewish thinker and poet of the 20th century, but in comparison to Kafka, unknown till today. But for the future, I will say she will be very important. Her name is Margarete Sussman. And she gave a kind of approach to Kafka's work 5 years after his death. And this perspective of her is unique at this time and in some elements until today. So after the break, we will have not only Kafka, but a kind of another one looking on him in 1929. So I'll start with these inner struggles of Kafka, well known in all biographies. A friend said, in Franz Kafka lived the most marvelous, soulful consciousness of guilt, the awareness of the imperfection of the world and of man, an imperfection for which man blames himself. Kafka, as far as I can see, is never talking about the imperfection of humanity, but of Franz Kafka. He takes it all under his own responsibility. He, as a constant failure, this is at least an expression of the diaries, of the letters. I doubt a little bit if we can really take the diaries and the letters as the innermost conviction of Kafka, not because he's lying at all, but because he was a writer. And everything he was writing in a letter, in a diary, this is also literature in Kafka's case. So it's not as easy to take the autobiographical material as the true testimony of, or let's say as the last word. And he was very humoristic. So even if there was an extremely serious tone in the biography and lifestyle of Kafka, he has also a sense of humor quite elaborated. So also a sense of exaggeration. And he liked it. And in so forth, this is a little bit tricky to interpret Kafka from his own words about himself. But on the other side, it is really also important. I once published a book about Kafka and his disease and his kind of handling this tuberculosis disease. For him, it was not primarily a somatic problem, but a moral problem. So the inner conviction that we don't possess health, and then an accident is coming, but he said, no, health is never a personal possession. It is a bestowed good. It is a grace, more or less. And if we lose this, it has something to do with our lifestyle or with our sin. So we failed in perform our lives. And this is at least one of the possible ways to get ill. Sin as the root of every disease. It has an element of Old Testament where the misery states, the unhealthy states, always are alarming signs, symptoms that maybe something in your life is wrong, and not only an accident of a cell, of a metabolism, but the metabolism is an expression of the individual behavior. This is an extreme moralistic approach to disease. But on the other side, the 20th century discovered it is not completely wrong. Our diseases, they have something to do with our biographies and lives. And to separate a somatic disease from the rest of the biography isn't the path to truth. But in a way, Kafka was very radical, at least in the diaries and letters, saying, I'm guilty. And it is not because only the disease, but there's a general trait in the letters, in the diaries, to say, I have missed my life. The hesitation before birth. If there is a transmigration of souls, then I am not yet on the lowest level. My life is the hesitation before birth. So the unlived life. There wasn't the slightest bit of life management on my part. It was as if the center of the circle has been given to me like any other person's, as if I then had to walk the decisive radius like another person and then draw the beautiful circle of the biography. But instead, I kept making an attempt to reach the center of the circle, but always had to break it off immediately. Examples: piano playing, violin playing, languages, German studies, anti-Zionism studies, Zionism studies, Hebrew, gardening, carpentry, literature, attempts of marriage, my own flat. It all failed. Or it was not continued. So he couldn't find the center of the radius. Because if you found the center, then you can do the radius and then you can do the circle. But if you are not sure in finding the center, you can never draw the radius and then there will be no circle. but it's a humoristic description. It is true, but in a way, he said, I failed to move to the center of my existence, or sometimes he called it moving into the house of my incarnation. Or in a letter of one of his best friends, Max Brod, kind of a reflection review, I have remained clay. I have not made the spark into fire, but only used it to illuminate my corpse. There's also a sense of humor in it. He had a kind of a spark, but he never created the fire of existence, but only illuminated the physical dying corpus. So, but I want to just touch the theme. There are many descriptions of Kafka like this. This feeling of imperfection, of failure, or not being able, this unlived life. On the other side, an enormous life in his head he had a feeling. Not that he said, I'm full of intuitions. And no, but he said, there's immense world in my head. But how can I free myself from these thoughts? They want to be liberated, these thoughts, and they are all in my head. He had a lot of problems with insomnia. He couldn't find sleep quite often. And once he stated in the diary, I am a memory that has come alive, hence the insomnia. So I'm a living memory, I can't forget. It is all consciousness. And then we are always awakened, and there is no way, maybe we can say from the head to the body, to the limbs, to the world, to live in the world. And we come back to Steiner's description. But in fact, he lived in the world. I mean, Kafka was not a person lying in the bed the whole day. He studied, and he made a PhD, and he was a lawyer working in an enterprise. And so he lived his life, but he always had a feeling it's not really his own life. It is more in the head. And the head became sick because of all these thoughts. And then the head posed the questions, is there somebody else in the body who is interested in survival? And the lung said, hello, here. And then it's very wonderful description about the conversation between lung and head. And the head asked if there is assistance, and the lung took over some of the problems of the head. Interestingly, that Steiner describes the tuberculosis constitution in one of the spiritual lectures for anthroposophical medicine in the sense that the lung is becoming partly head. That some of the forces of the head live in the lung, in the rhythmical system. But apart from that, we come back to Kafka. It's a funny description how this tuberculosis started. For him, it started in the head, not in the lung, but the lung assistant help or offered assistance and so on. But I won't go into the misery of the disease now. But maybe it's also full of humor when he said in the tuberculosis, it is even biblical. Anyone who cannot fully absorb the creative breath of life must be ill in everything. So not to be able to breathe in, unable to draw a full, dignified breath. Because inspiration, in the sense of becoming truly human, Dr. Steiner said in the Waldorf school, they have to learn to breathe at the beginning and to sleep. And maybe Kafka would have said, that's my problem. I never learned in my early childhood or in my early school days to breathe properly and to sleep properly. And then he said, and because this is true, I am that little poor person possessed by all kinds of evil spirits. So in his description, funny description partly, he's describing himself as possessed by evil forces. It's funny, but partly he took it for serious. And this is a little bit also now a point leading to the second element. What about writing? I said he was one of maybe the famous writer of the 20th century, but I don't know other writers, Celan is coming close to him, who took writing as so important as Kafka. For him, it was a sacred, absolute, pure profession is not the right word, mission. Once he stated in the diary, writing as a form of prayer. And it was also the last author Paul Celan was studying before he committed suicide. This absolute understanding of literature. But literature for Kafka, it is not the right word. It's not only literature, it's writing. So here some of the people in the Edith Marion house are book publishers, because at the Goetheanum we had a conference for booksellers and publishers. So we dealt yesterday and today with the challenge of books and literature. And it's good to end our meeting for those who are still here with this view to Kafka, who for him it was not just to write a book or to publish it. It was an inner duty. He said, it's my destiny. It's the only inner possibility of existence. And if I fulfill it, I will live. And if it's unfulfilled, I have to die soon. So there are many, many books about Kafka as an author, about his understanding of writing, understanding of inner truth. And it's interesting, at least for us here in Dornach, or let's say for our anthroposophical friends, that in his personal encounter with Rudolf Steiner, Kafka not only talked about writing, but also in comparison to what is Steiner doing as spiritual research. And he said to Steiner, according to Kafka's diary, because after the encounter, which happened end of March 1911 in Prague, 28th of March 1911, they had a conversation, and after the conversation, Kafka wrote in the diary what he said to Steiner. And one passage, my luck, he said to Steiner, my abilities, and every opportunity to utilize them in some way have always been in the literary field. And here, however, in writing, I have experienced states, Zustände, he's writing, not many, which, in my opinion, are very close to the clairvoyant states you describe, Doctor, in which I dwelt in these states of consciousness, completely in every idea, but also fulfilled every idea, and in which I felt not only at my limits, but at the limits of the human being in general, an den Grenzen der Menschheit. And Kafka is not a pretender. So this knowing it from inside, as a difference to you, Dr. Steiner, you have this calmness of enthusiasm, being calm. I not. And there are other differences. But it's for Kafka, writing or living in these states of consciousness was an extreme situation. He once had a girlfriend, they were even engaged. Felice Bauer, quite well known because of of Kafka's letters to her, such a thick book. 2 times engaged. In one letter, she obviously asked him if it is so necessary that he is so alone in writing, in these extreme states of writing in the nights, and she would love to be with him, just to be in the same room. And then he answered, I just don't think I could write then. And explaining, you know, Felice, to write means to open oneself up to the point of excess, the extreme frankness and devotion in which a person already believes to lose himself in human intercourse, and from which he will therefore always shy away as long as he is in the right mind. For everyone wants to live as long as he lives. This frankness and devotion is by no means sufficient for writing. Meaning, for Kafka, it's maybe not for every human being, to be open to another one is always carrying the risk that you lose yourself. And therefore, he said, every human being who wants to keep alive has to take care that he's not going away in a relationship. But this act of devotion, of frankness, he said, Offenheit, Hingabe, this must be much more intensified in writing in comparison to a human relationship. And then he adds the other sentence, that's why you can't be alone enough when you write. That's why it can't be quiet enough around you when you write. The night is still too little night. And maybe as readers of Kafka, you know the story maybe of his very famous narrative or also story called The Judgment, Das Urteil. And it's well known from Kafka's diary and letters that he wrote this moving story in one night. So he started at 10 o'clock in the evening, it was the 22nd of September 1912, and he stopped at 6 o'clock in the morning. And he said, I was writing all the time. And then it was done. The terrible effort and joy as the story unfolded in front of me, as I moved forward in a body of water. Several times that night I carried my weight on my back. How everything can be said, how a great fire is prepared for all, for the strangest ideas as they pass away and rise again. For Kafka, writing, obviously, if it was really fulfilled, was such a kind of a dramatic action. And to a friend of him, he once said, this story, The Judgment, is the ghost of one night. Das Gespenst einer Nacht, he said. So for him, writing was not just writing. He said it is a strange, mysterious, perhaps dangerous, perhaps redeeming consolation. So it's a very deep topic. What is writing for Kafka? But of course it is an action of absolute concentration but going into a realm also of darker forces. He described it quite often. During the night, I realized with the clarity of a child's visual lesson that it is the reward for the devil's services. This going down to the dark forces, this unleashing of spirits bound by nature, embraces and whatever else may be going on. So something happens there. And now you know some of the stories. Also, I would say, of the brutal stories. This aggressivity, which was so different to Kafka's personality, that some people had really a problem to understand how this man is able to create this story. But he said, you know, it's not mine. I had to deliver it. I gave birth to it. But I had to live in that night with these figures. In between those figures, I had to survive. This is how he described it. I can't say that that's what happened. It is his self-description. And sometimes he said he felt dirty in the morning, with dirty fingers, birth and afterbirth. And if you go into some of these stories with these forces of destruction, one of his younger friends, Gustav Janoch, once said to Kafka, obviously, we don't know it because there was no stenographer, but Janoch in his memory describes this. Some people doubted of the truth of the memory, but I don't know. It's maybe a mixture. Janoch said, I said to Kafka, I believe what you are describing is not the present but the future. You will be a writer of the 20th century, and the coming brutality and the dark forces. But then Janoch describes Kafka was desperate when he heard this said by the other one and said to his friend, you know, you must remain silent as an author if you cannot help. No one should aggravate the patient's condition through their hopelessness. That's why a whole scribble should be destroyed. My whole writings should be destroyed. I am not a light. I have only got lost in my own thorns. I am a dead end. If this is true, what Gustav Janoch is describing, then Kafka said, my writings have to be destroyed because it's my own hopelessness. And these are my own thorns, die eigenen Dornen. And you shouldn't distribute this to other persons. It reminds me to our Primo Levi evening. Maybe some of you have followed the lecture, at least via Zoom or later on the homepage of the General Anthroposophical section. Primo Levi, late in his biography, was asked to translate one of the process of Kafka for an Italian publisher. And he did it, but he could hardly survive the translation or the darkness of that book. And he knew, Primo Levi, that this man is a brilliant writer. And it is the truth. But he said, I don't know if it's good to get this book translated and distributed. And what does it mean if young people are reading this perspective of the world? So he hesitated. If it's good, I mean, he knew it was a level of literature far beyond the average, but in a way dangerous. So maybe Gustav Janoch. I come a little bit speedy now to the third point. This man seems to be very isolated and depressive. And on the other side, and I studied a lot of these memories of the friends and the other ones, he was deeply befriended. And he had a real sense for the counterpart. Once he said to Gustav Janoch, the same man, only the concrete, real person, the neighbor, whom God places in our path and to whose work we are directly exposed, is real. The only reality on earth is the neighbor. Is the other one who is placed by God on our path. To Max Brod, he once said, you know, the true word from person to person, that it is essential. And there are also wonderful descriptions of Kafka that letters are kind of a seduction or an error. We would say emails. Okay, letters are better, but there were no emails at this time. But he said, you know, what is in the letters, it is not going really from one to the other one. This is a kind of deviation, and they have a kind of their own life, letters. We know it sometimes, or not only from letters, or from articles, so statements. Then we meet these writers of the articles. Some of them are gentle human beings, but the article was very aggressive, or it was so decisive, so expressed, so, and also letters. I personally love letters of Franz Kafka to many of the friends, but I can understand what he's saying, that there is a kind of a seduction of better, he said, the direct word from person to person. On the other side, we have this description that Kafka, not only in the perspective of writing, says, human beings are too much for me. The looks of the people, their presence, their being, and looking over, all that is too strong for me. Sometimes he said, it's all too much. I have to bring myself in a safe situation. And especially the fear of being connected, deeper connected. So getting engaged, falling in love with Felice power, flowing over, he said, this flowing over. I lose myself. And also the question of responsibility and commitment. For him, engagement, Verlobung in German, was not just to become engaged. It means to unite your own being with the other one. But who I am, to bring myself with all the problems and the burden to another one. Isn't it spoiling the other one's existence? So he has, appearingly, from the letters and diaries, an extreme moralistic approach to the question of responsibility. People fell in love and they lived together or not, but for him it wasn't that easy, because destiny and the other destiny, I think there's an enormous sensibility. What does it mean to unite yourself? And then once he said, you know, I have only very, very rarely crossed the borderland between solitude and community. I have even settled more in it than in solitude itself. So settled in this borderland between solitude and community. He was searching for community, but this borderland. I mean, for many people in the 20th century, also these reflections of Kafka became very interesting, anticipating not only borderline patients, know that it isn't so easy with human relationship if we take them for very serious. But he had relationships. Also to the youngest sister, not a loving relationship in a sense of a loving story, but what a kind of a sister relationship to the youngest sister, Otla. It's a very wonderful sister, wonderful story, but I want to come to point 4 and 5. So, or to Milena Jasenska. If we would have Czech friends here, hopefully they will know Milena. She was a famous Czech writer, journalist, and translator. And she translated Kafka, and they fell in love, both of them, and had a wonderful friendship. But then, at a certain point, he had to go back. But he gave her his diaries, which he never did before, and he felt very connected about her. But this is another story. There's a wonderful book. She died in a German concentration camp, not as a Jewish person, but as a communist person, being in a political resistance, and ended up in Ravensbrück, which is one of the concentration camps of Germany, north of Berlin. And another inmate, another prisoner, wrote a book about her who survived the camp. So it is important to read Milena Jesenská. But I will come to Dora Dumont, this last loving situation of Kafka and a kind of redemption. I would really say a kind of redemption. She came from a Polish Hasidic Orthodox family with, I think she had 5 brothers and sisters, but mother early died and she had to take care for the children. But after the second marriage of the father, she had a feeling she could go. And she always wanted to be a scholar, which was in Orthodox Jewish Hasidic families not allowed. So the scholars were the men. They studied Hebrew and Halacha, the rules, das Gesetz. But she wanted to do it. Yentl, in a way, you know the film maybe. And she went to Krakow. And from Krakow, she escaped to Berlin, but the family drew her back. But the second escape to Berlin succeeded. And she met Kafka. And he was very close to East European Judaism. Maybe it came into his life when he was 27 first. I don't know, but this is what the biographers said. Because there was a Yiddish theater group coming to Prague. And they made theater performances. And they were one of these groups who come and go. And he fell completely in love with what they did, and with the Yiddish language, and with the actor, especially one male actor, Yitzhak Levi. And they became friends, and Kafka organized evenings for him, and also gave a lecture, Kafka himself, a speech over the Yiddish language. Kafka himself, in the city hall, the Jewish city hall of Prague in 1912. And they always they keep the relationship. Kafka had also other friends who were close to Hasidic rabbis, Georg Langer and so on. And he was touched by the Zionism movement quite early in his biography and wanted to go to see Palestine. Even he was a little bit skeptical about this Zionist movement, but he wanted to see the land. And when he heard first about the first kibbutzim, they started, as you know, on the Lake of Gennesaret in 1912 around, he was fascinated. A new community of human beings, selfless, simple, and by their hands to work, without private property, no money, just living for the community. So he was reading Zionist organs. He went to a Zionist Congress to Vienna. He met quite often with his former school classmate, Hugo Bergmann, who was one of the prominent Zionist leaders. They were friends from childhood on, and Hugo Bergmann later on became the president of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, later on. The only university on earth who commemorated the 100th birthday of Dr. Steiner in 1961 by a prominent speech of the president of the Hebrew University, Hugo Bergmann. It was in Jerusalem, by the way. And this was the classmate, the little boyfriend of Franz Kafka, who, going to Palestine, passed Goethe Annum, saying goodbye to Dr. Steiner because he was a scholar of anthroposophy. His mother-in-law, Berta Fanta, was a branch leader in Prague, the famous one, Berta Fanta. And she had this kind of, maybe you know this kind of meetings there in the saloon of Berta Fanta, not only anthroposophists, other people, Kafka, Albert Einstein, philosophers. Quite an interesting life, this wonderful Prague at this time. So Hugo Bergmann went to Palestine. He became responsible for the library of the Hebrew University, which was founded 1st of April 1925. So Dr. Steiner died here, 30th of March, 1st of April, the university was founded. It was conceived since 10 years, but then it is, and hopefully next year there is a commemoration of Hugo Bergman, and we are taking part. So we blended last year with a friend of Israel, or we had the idea together, and hopefully there will be a chance. It depends, of course, on how it goes on with the political situation. But we are on the spiritual level at the moment here in our reflection. So Hugo Bergman was, and for Kafka, he did not know about a state or a new state for Jews, Zionism, but he was attracted by Palestine, attracted, and it getting more and more intense. The Hebrew language, he did not grasp it at home, an assimilated family, but he wanted to learn it. So he took Hebrew lessons. He was reading Hebrew books, especially also the Hasidic legends. And there is a letter to his friend Max Brod saying the Hasidic stories are perhaps not the best. He just came across some of them in a journal. But all these stories are, I don't understand it, the only Jewish thing in which I feel equally and always at home, regardless of my personal conditions. In everything else, I'm only blown into it, and another breeze takes me away again. But in these Hasidic tales, the spirituality of everyday life, most of you will know Martin Buber and the other collections, Chaim Bloch and others, he felt at home. And he also felt at home in the mystic Kabbalah tradition of Judaism, the esoteric Judaism. Feeling at home, I can't really say that's true, but in a way he came across. And I think it was a discovery of some of the Jewish professors in Germany and Jerusalem in the 80s of the 20th century to say that maybe this factor is much stronger in Kafka as the professional interpreter believed before. Because those knowing people about Kabbalah, as Kreuzinger and Stefan Moses, they knew that, let's see, only take the topics of judgment or the topics of justice, but judgment in the sense, this is real in the Kabbalah, that in a way, everyday judgment hangs over the world, for the world was created in judgment. And this is its foundation. It's a sentence not from Kafka and the process, but from a 17th century Kabbalistic book. God's power of judgment. His rule is the way of judgment. So we know that from in Kafka's stories, the judgment or the trial plays an enormous role. And this is not all Kabbalah, but in a way, Gershom Scholem once said, if you want to understand Kabbalah in our time, start with Kafka. It's a good preparation for it. The spiritual world, the hierarchy is not, I don't know where, but here, but maybe hidden. And the trial here. So not only after death, but here. And also the person of the gatekeeper or the guardian of the threshold, a very important person in the Kabbalah. That the gate is closed or a little bit open, but there is a guardian. It's a long story, but I think he was attracted. And then I come to the end, to Dora. It was interesting that Hugo Bergman came from Palestine back to Prague and gave a lecture about the cultural life in Palestine. The culture, not the political. And Kafka went. It was in summer 1923. So 9 months before he died, or 10. And he was so fascinated that at the end of the lecture, he went to Bergman and say, this lecture was just for me. And then he said, I will come to see. And really, Else, Miss Bergman, his wife, invited Kafka to live with them in Jerusalem. And she said, it's so dry and hot. Your tuberculosis will fade away after a certain time. So they invited him and he decided, I will come. I will do something quite radical. He was quite ill at this time. Maybe this is the point. And Hugo Bergman later said it was not the earthly Jerusalem which he had in mind, but maybe it was not the total spiritual opposite, but something in between as often. And then Kafka said, maybe I should first, before I go to Palestine, maybe I should make a test for my transportability. And then go first to the Baltic Sea. That's what he did, because he was invited to go with his sister Ellie and the children to the Baltic Sea. But there, in the Baltic Sea, he met children, Jewish children, from a holiday colony. And they came from Berlin. And there was in Berlin a little house, not so little, Jewish people's home, Jüdisches Volksheim, opened by Gustav Landauer in 1916. What was it? A house, or a bigger house, a place for children and youth, Jewish children. A lot of them came from East Europe with their families in this poor quarter in Berlin. They lived there on the streets and they were invited to come in. It was a kind of a schooling path, but also puberty and adolescents were invited. And they got kind of classes, education, but also crafts, handicraft. Some of them were prepared for going to Palestine. They did a lot of theater there. There were also students group, Jewish students, other students. It was has a sense of Buber's renaissance of Judaism, spiritual Judaism, but also an element of we learn to live together, a living community, maybe no kibbutz, but preparing a kibbutz. And when Kafka heard about it in 1916, he was fascinated. And Martin Buber, but also Max Prohl were supporting financially das Jüdische Volksheim, Dragonerstraße, Berlin, today Max-Beer-Straße, if you are, maybe you are not at home in Berlin. And now these children came from their holiday colony. And so Kafka went and wanted to see, and they invited him, not only the children, but the teachers, to join them for a theater performance, for a Shabbat celebration. And he felt absolutely wonderful there. And especially there was such a young woman, Dora, one of the teachers, this one from Poland, from the Hasidic family, who escaped luckily and was one of the teachers, and he did rhythmic dancing with the children. And she was at home in Yiddish literature, Sholem Aleichem, who you know probably, Isaac Leib Peretz, and the whole Yiddish language, but also excellent Hebrew. She was an excellent Hebrew. Also, she could recite it. She could really, she was talking to him about Yesaiah and reading in Hebrew. And he was so touched and they fell in love. And then he said, I'll come to Berlin. And maybe we can then from Berlin go together to Palestine. We prepare Palestine in Berlin. And in fact, Kafka had many such plans to live together with, he never did. But with her, yes. And he moved to Berlin. He was very sick. But he moved to Berlin and lived with her in Berlin-Steglitz, which is quite a more calm part of the city. And they had a very cheerful time there together. There are many wonderful stories. And when Max Brod came to visit Kafka, he said, completely transformed, sleeping, cheerful. In a way, what happened to him? And also Kafka's sister Otla came and they saw him. 2 or 3 days days a week he went with Dora to a kind of a university, Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. It was a kind of a free university for Judaism, spiritual Judaism, and he took courses for Hebrew, Talmud, and also Halacha, so the stories, the Jewish stories, and yeah, they had a wonderful time. I shortened, but he became extremely ill in this cold Berlin winter. And at the end, he had to be more or less transported to a hospital, not in Berlin, it was too expensive, but to Vienna University Hospital. And at the end, he came to this killing. So they had this wonderful time together from middle September till December, but then he got high fever. But they lived together, and it was possible for him, and she accompanied him till the end, till the very last day, in a very touching way. So I come back to the starting point, and she said, you know, for me, when I saw him first, this Franz Kafka, it was for me as seeing for the first time what is a human being, or how a human being was meant to be. First time my true image of a man was fulfilled by him. This is maybe a very strange explanation, but in a way I found more of them. Also Max Brod and others, Franz Werfel. It's very interesting that beside all problems of inner life, they regarded him as a really true human being. Becoming true. Of course, if you become true, in the sense also of the Michael school, the life isn't get easier. It's getting more difficult partly. But this becoming true, a true human being. And yeah, he was highly respected by the other ones. Now he's famous as a writer. He wasn't famous. He published some stories. But another author said, you know, when he came to our circle in Prague, for me, he was something as a saint. He came to this intellectual circle, but then when Kafka came to any event, which happened rarely that he came, everyone held the breath. Kafka is here. So in a way, they realized he's different. Franz Werfel said he was a king. Difficult to, a long explanation. Very interesting. Yeah. He said, no, not at all. And in one diary entry, he said, I have not been led into life by the hand of Christianity. Also, it is already sinking heavenly like Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was, he said, led into life by the hand of sinking, but Christianity. And I have not yet caught the last tip of the flying Jewish prayer shawl, like the Zionists. I am the end or the beginning. In a way, they had the feeling he is more a beginner, but I did not know of what. Beyond classical Christian and Judaism, yeah, a riddle of an existence. And I end in Palestine, Israel, more or less now Israel in 49. Dora came to Israel. She became a mother from another man years after he died. And with the daughter, alone with the daughter, she came to Israel. And she sent a letter to Max Brod, who was also living in Israel. This whole thing still seems quite unbelievable to me. I have just realized that I'm so happy to see you. I long so unspeakably for France. The longing of all these years is so concentrated that I become completely helpless when I spend time with him. Franz's dream was to have a child and go to Palestine. Now I have a child without Franz, and I'm going to Palestine. So in a way, she came. She died 7 years later, quite young. And of course, the history of Palestine and Israel, it's very difficult. But it was for Kafka a land of hope. Beyond all problems, and he saw the coming problems also there, but there was light in the darkness. And I will end with a sentence of Hugo Bergmann. Kafka died in 24, 100 years ago. This Dora, we are 100 years later. And just in between, in 1974, there is a letter from Hugo Bergmann, 50 years ago, about Franz Kafka to a friend in the United States. And Bergmann is saying, you know, the deepest sorrow of Kafka was the separation of mankind. And he was always striving for unity of mankind. And Zionism and Judaism, they have an element of separation. Maybe needed separation, but separation. And Kafka wanted to overcome this separation, to find a bridge. And then Bergmann says, you know, he came from Prague. He was one of these Jewish Bohemian people. And they had this kind of bridge over the Moldau, but also a bridge in between Christianity, Judaism, Arabism. They had it in their heart. And Bergmann was one of these groups in Israel, Brit Shalom. So the first group who really said we have to live here with our neighbors. And we are connected to the Arabs. These are not at all strange to us. So what we have to create here is not a nation in the sense of military and protection, but we have to create neighborhood. Brit Shalom, and also later on a center was on the Hebrew University initiatives, but in the 50s, in the 40s, in the 30s, to create a new living community, Jews and Arabs, and not a nation state, but an association modus, threefolding. This was what the first articles of Hugo Bergmann in Jerusalem was about, threefolding in Hebrew. So I think this letter from 1974 from Hugo Bergmann, just in between us and Kafka's death day, has a lot to do with the future. And in this letter, Bergmann is saying maybe it is one of the deepest tasks of Judaism is to be mediators, transmitters, helping to bridge, but not forming isolated other groups. So Hugo Bergmann, who was a prominent philosopher and a prominent leading spirit in spiritual Jerusalem and at university, we will think on him in the coming time, also here at the Goethe-Ahn, where he was partly at home. It's wonderful that this friend of Kafka was this president of a Hebrew university, and Kafka died early, but the other ones tried. They will be all very sad now in the spiritual world about what was the outcome at the moment. But it is very dark in Kafka's story, but not only dark. There is light in the darkness. And I hope that our second lecture tonight, after this needed break, will help us also a little bit to understand why the door in Kafka's case is not really closed, but there is something a little bit open. So this is the image I wanted to draw tonight, starting with the death of Kafka and then going a little bit back and these different stages, an ending. I don't know why, but maybe yes, in Palestine, spiritual Palestine, not political Zionism, but cultural, in the sense of Achat Ha'am, and this whole question of how to bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Prague means the threshold. Praha is the threshold, from the Czech meaning of the word. And Kafka was really somebody knowing about thresholding and bridging, and partly tragic, but not only tragic, partly dark, but also light. Thank you for being with us in this reflection. And now we all need to break, and then hopefully we'll come back to Margareta Sussman's view on Franz Kafka. Thank you a lot.
So good evening also from my side here at the House Marion, and also wherever you are hearing. We had now a wonderful picture of this very important citizen of the 20th century, Franz Kafka. And now in my contribution, I would like to introduce a little bit the thoughts and the view of Margaret Sussman, her view on Kafka, her view of Kafka. And we will have in some weeks also some views on the life and the work of this very important citizen, this woman of the 20th century. Maybe just some little information about her life. She is not so well known, but for sure she will become more and more known. With all what she saw from the 20th century, with all what she could see through the people she met during this 20th century, and all what she thought and wrote. So Margarete Sussman was born in 1872 in Hamburg, and she died the 16th of January 1966 in Zurich. That means that she was born 11 years before Kafka, and she died almost 42 years after he died. So we can see that his life was embedded in her lifetime. And this is very remarkable, because in a certain sense, we can say that she saw what was Kafka writing about, this lost of the human being that could guide the human being to this inhumanity of the 20th century. She was seeing that coming, that what Kafka was also seeing as a reality and expressing in his literature. But then he died. He died 1924, and she was alive during all those years where that what he was speaking about suddenly became the deepest reality. So she was a Jewish German philosopher of religion. She was a cultural essayist. She was a poet. Already with 25, she published her first poetry book, Neue Gedichte. She was a feminist, and she was also, in a certain sense, a revolutionary person, also in Judaism. She knew during this 20th century many of so many important people, important thinkers, important sociologists. She was very close to Georg Simmel in Berlin. She was a close friend to Ernst Bloch, to Martin Buber, to Gustav Landauer. She was the first to write about the most important book, 1921, from Franz Rosenzweig, The Star of Redemption. And she started very soon to be a writer for the Frankfurter Zeitung, this big journal in Frankfurt. And later on, also for many, many years, she was a permanent contributor to a journal of German Jews, Der Morgen. And it will be also in this journal, Der Morgen, where she will publish this first interpretation, this first essay about Franz Kafka, as we heard before, 5 years after his death. She wrote a book after the war. She wrote this, the Book of Job and the Fate of the Jewish People, published in 1946. And this book is not so well known because in a certain sense we can say that there was silence around this book. And it's also not easy to talk about this content, the content of this book nowadays, with all this suffering that we are seeing in Palestine, in Gaza, in Israel. And this book is not the center of what I will now introduce here, but it's very remarkable that in this book she will take contents that she already wrote about when she wrote about Kafka so many years before, in this article that she wrote in 1929. The Book of Job and the Fate of the Jewish People is the first attempt after the Shoah, a first attempt to understand what happened from the point of view of this struggle with God. And as we know, many thinkers, poets, artists, intellectuals affirmed after Auschwitz that there is no poetry possible anymore. There was a question, even is God thinkable, understandable after Auschwitz? And one example of dealing with this question, struggling with this question, is Hans Jonas, who wrote this beautiful, very important book, I would say, The Concept of God After Auschwitz. Is it possible to think on God after what happened there? And Margaret Sussman tries to think God after Auschwitz very soon, if we think 1946, and to understand, or at least to approach with hope on the existence, the further existence of the possibility to think on God. And we can also understand that it was not easy for people to read, and it remains a question. How can we receive this theodicy, this attempt to still remain believing in God, in a God that sees what was going on? So she was introduced to Kafka by a good friend of her, probably around 1922, and in her autobiography that she published in 1964, so 2 years before she died, and she was already not able anymore to see. She was almost totally blind, so she needed to dictate parts of this autobiography named I Have Lived Many Lives. She writes there that a friend, Grüthusen, showed her Kafka's The Castle soon after the appearance of this book. And then she writes in her autobiography, I picked up the book too, found it difficult to understand at first, but I realized immediately that it was something great. And since I recognized its greatness and I was asked by many about its significance, I tried with all my might to work out the meaning of this poetry. Thus, the first German essay on Kafka appeared in the magazine Der Morgen in 1929, which still seems to me to be basically correct today after so much and so decisive has been written about him, especially after his diaries have been published, and even if I would certainly write it differently today. So, as I said before, the jaw problem in Franz Kafka, as it was then called, this article, is considered to be the first major interpretation of Kafka, and it was also one of the first journalistic appreciations of Kafka in Germany. And Margaret Sussman published years before, around 3 years before she published this text about Kafka, an essay on the significance of the Bible in the present days. And we can see that in her essay on Kafka, there is a direct link between what she writes about the struggle of Joe and Kafka's literature. So the history of Joe in the so-called Old Testament is this history of a man that was devoted to God, that believed on God, that respected God, and he is led into a deep temptation, and he loses everything. He loses his family, he loses what he possessed, he loses his health, he loses the friends, and he's all the time asking God, why? What have I done wrong? What is wrong? Why I deserve that? Tell me, please, say, what was wrong? And he has no answer for that, but just this deeper and deeper losses and this absolute alienation from the world, this being totally left alone, the deepest experience of rejection. And for Margaret Sussman, this is a very deep question, she says, a central question for the understanding of the Jewish people in the exile. So she will later also write about Zionism. She was not for a national state, but she saw the struggles around the Zionistic questions. But when she writes and speaks about this question of the struggle with God and Joe's struggle with God as a central question for understanding the Jewish people, she means here the Jewish people in the exile, in the diaspora. And she says the central question is the question about God's justice. Is there any justice of God in the face of this infinite suffering and this absolute incommensurability between the human and the divine justice? There is no possibility to put together immediately one-to-one the human justice, the struggle of the human being for justice, and this perspective on God's justice. And she starts in this essay on Kafka saying that there are 3 different states, so to say, with this struggling about the question of God's justice, of the theodicy, of the theodicy. What is theodicy? Theodicy is the question, how can a God that is all-powerful, that is in all places, and that is good, how is it possible for such a God to let the suffering exist? And this theodicy question, she says, is a central question. And she starts saying in this essay on Kafka that the first moment of this question of theodicy, we can see this moment in the story of Jeremias in the Old Testament. But Jeremias, in a certain sense, the prophet Jeremias, he knows why he is suffering. He understands that there was a failure, and because of that, he suffers. Then we have Job's suffering, the suffering of Job, and Job is not able to understand because he was devoted to God, because he strived to be a right human being in facing God. And then the third stage of this question, she will say, is by Kafka. And then she will go into that. We can say that her text, The Problem of Job in Kafka, is in a certain sense an alert and an horrified look into this abyss that had already become visible, we can say, in the beginning of the 20th century and opened up during Kafka's lifetime, but will be totally concrete and visible after the death of Kafka. It is in this text of her, as in others, very remarkable how deeply he could hear, I would say now, she could hear the voices of the 20th century through that what, as an example, was expressed by Kafka. So she could read, I would say, her time through that what she could see in Kafka. Yeah, so in this text, she writes that this story of Job is the story of the Jewish people. Of the Jewish people, I repeat, in the exile. And now I will read some paragraphs, one after the other, and saying something in between, out of this text. So she writes, the fate of Job, whom God gave up to the tempter in his suffering, prefigures the entire suffering of Judaism in exile. Like Job, the Jewish people accept this suffering as imposed by God, but he does not simply accept it. They want to understand it. That is, they want to understand the God for whose sake they suffer. Like Job, it demands that the God under whose support and judgment it stands be the absolute righteous one. And that is why Judaism in exile also lives in a single process and constant quarrel with God. So she says that the theodicy, so the repeated attempts to understand God, to explain the origin of suffering and guilt and their connection in life, this is a great question for the Judaism in exile. But she says also that this theodicy, this attempt, and now I read, is increasingly changing its forms under the pressure of historical developments. It is increasingly sized by contact and confrontation with the environment. And now she names the Hasidism, which was very also important for her, also as it was important, as we heard before, for Kafka. Hasidism, this great flame from the heart of the ghetto, which draws all its gloom and darkness into itself, and burns it into light. This Hasidism is the last great, explicitly religious theodicy of Judaism, that is, one that is connected to the revealed God. But a deep incision separates our world from him. And she says that for the Jewish people in exile, there is a deep incision when these Jewish people started to participate in the Occidental world, and then the fate of the Jewish human being turns from this direct relationship with God. She says that participating in the Occidental culture meant for the Jewish people in exile, in a certain sense, to lose the direct connection to this God. And she says that this God then started to be hidden, a hidden God, a God who cannot be longer be found at all. But she says the Jew stands and falls with God. And so, for the Jewish people, the loss of the relation with God is a deep, deep incision, is a deep abyss, a deep break. She writes, that is why the process with God will change its forms, but that is precisely why it will have to be resumed anew, in a new form, in a form in which God is completely silenced, in which the human being speaks alone, but in which, even if he conceals God's name, he is always speaking only with God. And then she writes directly after about Kafka. The figure of Franz Kafka stands in the late Occidental world. It cannot be detached from it. It's linked to it by 1,000 threads. It belongs to it. At first glance, there seems to be nothing at all in common between him and the world of the Old Testament. There, in the Old Testament, everything is the roar of the divine word, the breath of his living creation. Here, in Kafka's work, God is completely silenced. The pure negativity of a man-made, God-forsaken world. So for her, Kafka really draws this reality of the complete loneliness of the human being. And she says that this loss of the relation to God goes together with the absolute loss of the world's reality and the loss of the human being by himself. She wrote also, the word human being is no more legible to us today than the word God. It's not understandable anymore in this absolute loss. And then she will write that in Kafka, the lawfulness is no longer recognizable. We no longer know what we are supposed to do. In the end, all that remains is the question of how something can be done at all. For the first time in the Occidental world, the law has stepped completely out of life. Kafka has, in his own words, for the first time broken off the music of the world, which until then could at least be surmised down to its very depths. This fear for the world sinking before his eyes breaks out in all of Kafka's stories. And she says that others also could see that coming. And she names Strindberg and Dostoevsky, and how both already pointed out what then Kafka will bring into perfection. And again I read from her text, the undermining of our human being by countless conflicted alien forces at the same time, by the machine as well as by the driving world, by the economic structure as well as by the rationalization of all relations and relationships, breaks out openly in this world of Kafka. The world itself, life itself, is radically hollowed out, is destroyed. Yeah, and she says, as an example of this hopeless to find any meaning, we can read Kafka's legend Before the Law. And he named this also a legend. It is part of the trial, this story that he published, and where he describes, it was published by Kafka 1920, written before, but published 1920, where he describes that a man stands in front of the law and wants to enter the building. And there is a guardian, and then the man is not going into. And the whole legend is about this man standing there and not entering, and not taking the step to enter. And he stands his whole life there, waiting for a moment, asking himself, asking the guardian if he could, and he says, no, you have to wait. And then he thinks why, and so on. And this legend ends in the following way. When he was then very, very old and couldn't hear anymore, he asked the guardian, everyone strives for the law, says the man. How is it that in all these years, no one but me has asked to be let in? The doorkeeper realizes that the man is already at the end of his tether, and in order to reach his fading hearing, he shouts at him, no one else could gain entry here, because this entrance was only meant for you. I am leaving now and closing it. Yeah, so there is no shared world anymore. Margaret Sussman says, no shared world. The shared world is cancelled in Kafka's stories. And so there is this absolute human loneliness, this absolute being alone. And she writes that other than Joe, in Kafka, there is no complaint. She writes, but as great as the suffering and confusion caused by the distance from God is here, Kafka does not lament. Unlike Joe, there is no lamentations in his works. The most outrageous suffering, the most horrific fates are recounted, but nowhere is there any lamentation. Everything is too inescapable, too unchangeable, and God would not even hear the lament. But she says, yet if we read it, then we will see that finally also that and everything is also God's revelation. She writes, and yet, and that is the great mystery, although he has left it, everything in it is his revelation. And so Margret Sussman's interpretation, in her own words, Deutung, is that Kafka looks to the question of the struggle with God's justice not from the point of view of the human justice, but from the gaze, so to say, from the look, from the eyes coming from God's perspective. And she writes, this is what is so strange, so deeply religiously shocking about Kafka's world. Far from God, it is not seen from the world, from life. It is seen from God, from the law, and it's measured by him, by God, and judged by him. She says that in Kafka's stories, the measurement is not coming from the human measurements, but is in the measurements of God. And again I read, in a late letter, the terminally ill poet wrote to a friend, and now Kafka, I can still derive pleasure from works such as on the Landarzt, provided that they succeed, but happiness only if I can lift the world into the pure, the true, the unalterable. This, so until here Kafka, and now again Margret Sussman, this then is the great clear dream that lies shining at the bottom of his dark and confused world. The depiction of his God-forsaken world, which has sunk into nothingness in all its agonizing and gloomy truth, is in its essence nothing other than the depiction of his messianic longing. And so, for her, Kafka felt this deep, deep connection to hope. She says that he really brought to the final truth, in a certain sense, this absolute internal relying in the hope for God. She writes, Franz Kafka brought the truth of his time into dialogue with the eternal truth of Judaism. And if this, the confrontation of the temporal historical truth in which Judaism has been placed since its dispersion, with the eternal truth in which it is rooted, is the form and meaning of all the great Jewish achievements of the West in general, then none bears the traits of Joe's age-old confrontation with his God more purely and deeply than Kafka. Here as there, it is the fundamental force of the Jewish essence that sustains it, the defiance of all suffering. Here as there, it is the fundamental force of the Jewish being that sustains it, the paradoxical power of hope that defies all suffering and cannot be destroyed by it. Just as Joe exclaims in the midst of his God-imposed suffering, but I know that my Savior lives. So Franz Kafka says in his calm, restrained language, and now Kafka, it is no refutation of the premonition of a final liberation if the next day the captivity remains unchanged, or even intensifies, or even if it is expressly declared that it shall never end. On the contrary, all these can be a necessary precondition for final liberation. And now again, Sussman, after all the failure and despair of the world and life, hope, and only hope remains. And hope is the whole of life for a messianic human being. The fact that Franz Kafka asked his friends to burn all his works before his death shows that they were not written for people, but only for the eye of God. And this is how she ends this text that she published about Kafka. But in the very first version that she wrote before, the end of this text was different. And instead of that, there were other two paragraphs placed in this first thought version. And I would like to read it, and you will soon see why. And I am coming now towards an end. So, first she thought on finishing the text in the following way. And so, the firmly barricaded gate of our prison is nevertheless opened by a narrow crack. A strip of unearthly light penetrates. We know nothing, but that's also why we don't know whether this dark world of ours, which has been cast off by God, is the closest thing to redemption. So this was the first final paragraph for her text. Then she changed and it became, as I read before, but it's very interesting to see that the last words of the book of Job, which she wrote then and published 17 years later, in 1946, after the Shoah, sounds very, very similar. There too, she succeeds in writing about the infinity of hope, and Kafka's figure appears in this place. And I would like to finish this short introduction to this text written by Margaret Sussman about Kafka with these final paragraphs of the book that she wrote then, 1946, after the Shoah. It is this infinity of hope from which the late Jewish poet, who recognized the destruction and foreignness of our world like few others, made it visible in his poetry. Franz Kafka, in the midst of his world he had given up, pronounced the eternal yet of the world's redemption in a very simple, very sober, and only concealed messianic word. Kafka now. It is no refutation of the premonition of a final liberation if in the next day the captivity still remains unchanged, or even intensifies, or even if it is expressly declared that it shall never end. On the contrary, all these can be a necessary condition of a final liberation. And then again, Sussman, nevertheless, the firmly barricaded gate of our prison is opened by a narrow crack. A strip of supernatural light penetrates. Joe's insight prepares the way for it. We, who know so infinitely much, who know far too much, we know nothing. We know nothing of what is important for us alone, of the plan in which we are involved and from which we live. But that is also why we do not know whether this dark world of ours, which has drifted completely away from redemption, is not the closest to the redemption. Thank you very much for being with us in this evening about Kafka and also Kafka through Margarete Sussman. And yeah, thank you for being here.